Welcome to episode 3 of our low-class family recipes series, where we uncover the lost, the humble, and the heartwarming meals that once filled the kitchens of struggling American families. Today, we're diving into 20 forgotten one-pot meals that helped low-income households survive the hard-hit years of the 1940s, through war, poverty, and the tail end of the Great Depression. These aren't just recipes, they're time capsules, served hot in battered pots over wood-burning stoves, cooked by hands that carried the weight of a nation in crisis. Back then, there were no food delivery apps, no luxury ingredients, and definitely no waste. Every scrap mattered. A few potatoes, some leftover bacon grease, maybe half an onion. It was all thrown into a single pot and turned into a miracle of survival. These meals weren't pretty, but they were packed with creativity, sacrifice, and history. These were the dishes of factory workers, railroad men, coal miners, and single mothers holding their homes together while the world shifted around them. And though we don't talk about them much today, these meals were the quiet heroes of America's dinner tables, nourishing bodies and spirits during the toughest times. So stay with us till the very end, because some of these meals may surprise you, and a few just might inspire your next family dinner. From Hoover stew to cornbread and milk, we're bringing these dishes back to life, one pot at a time. Don't skip a second. The final few dishes are some of the rarest gems, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Let's step back into a forgotten kitchen of America's past and stir the pot of history. One of the most iconic one-pot meals to emerge from the era of hardship was Hoover stew. It wasn't just a recipe, it was a quiet protest served with a spoon. The name itself carried bitter irony. It was coined during the Great Depression and resurfaced during the early 1940s as families who had survived one crisis found themselves navigating another. The stew was named after President Herbert Hoover, whom many Americans blamed for the economic collapse of the 1930s. Calling it Hoover stew wasn't about honoring him, it was a jab. A way for poor families to say, "Look what we're left eating." But behind the sarcasm was a dish that saved lives. Hoover stew was a government-subsidized meal, often handed out in soup kitchens and public relief programs. Its ingredients were always basic: macaroni, hot dogs or canned meat, stewed tomatoes, and corn or beans, all boiled together in a large communal pot. Each batch looked different depending on what was available. No one followed a recipe, they followed necessity. For the families who made it at home, this stew could stretch a few cents worth of food into multiple meals. Kids didn't complain because it was hot and salty. Mothers added water to make it last. And despite its rough appearance, it represented the magic of turning almost nothing into something. The pot itself told a story, scarred from years of use, blackened from the fire, and heavy with history. Hoover stew was more than food. It was a shared survival tactic, especially in neighborhoods where neighbors traded leftovers and watched over one another's children. By the time World War II rationing took hold, the stew had evolved, with families using Victory Garden vegetables to replace costlier canned goods. Still, the name stuck, a bitter reminder of where the country had been and how far it still had to go. If Hoover stew was the food of survival, then Mulligan stew was the food of community, a dish born not just from poverty, but from shared humanity. Mulligan stew dates back even further than the 1940s. It was a staple during the Great Depression of the 1930s and found new life in the early 40s when war tightened its grip on the American home front. It wasn't a recipe written down in any official cookbook. It was invented in the hobo camps, shanty towns, and roadside gatherings where people who had lost everything came together just to make it through the day. What made Mulligan stew different was that it wasn't prepared by a single person. It was a collaborative meal, thrown together by a group of strangers, each contributing what little they had. One person might toss in a few potatoes, another a half can of beans, someone else a bone for broth, or a pinch of salt from a battered tin. Cooked over a fire in a battered metal pot, it was stirred not just with spoons, but with stories, hopes, and broken dreams. During the early 1940s, as families began relocating to cities for war-related jobs, urban soup circles emerged that mimicked the Mulligan method. In back alleys and empty lots, people who barely knew each other pooled scraps together to create something warm and filling. It wasn't glamorous, but it meant nobody went hungry that night. The stew itself changed every time. sometimes watery, sometimes hearty. It could be made with cabbage and turnips one day, and with rice and canned meat the next. It wasn't the ingredients that mattered, it was the act of coming together, of reclaiming dignity through a shared pot. Mulligan stew was more than a meal. It was a symbol, a dish that whispered, "We may be poor, but we are not alone." As the war years stretched on, families across America had to make the most of what was cheap, available, and filling. Enter the humble cabbage and potato skillet, a simple yet vital dish that became a staple on many low-income tables. Cabbage and potatoes were two of the few foods that remained accessible and affordable, even during rationing. Cabbage, hardy and easy to grow in victory gardens, provided essential vitamins and fiber. Potatoes, packed with calories and versatile, were a reliable source of energy for hard-working families. When combined in a skillet, often cooked with just a bit of fat or leftover bacon grease, they created a warm, satisfying meal that could feed an entire family for little cost. This skillet dish is a window into the resilience of America's working class. It reflected how resourcefulness met necessity in kitchens everywhere, from crowded urban apartments to small rural homes. Women who had lost husbands to war or unemployment became masters of stretching minimal ingredients without sacrificing comfort or taste. Historical records reveal that cabbage and potato skillet wasn't glamorous, but it was a lifesaver. In some factory towns, lunch breaks meant gathering around a shared skillet, swapping stories, and refueling before returning to grueling shifts. The smell of sizzling cabbage and potatoes was a quiet reminder that, despite hardship, life went on. Interestingly, this dish also symbolized a cultural blend. Many immigrant families brought recipes from Europe that featured cabbage and potatoes, adapting them to American wartime conditions. Over time, this simple skillet became a symbol of community endurance and cultural adaptation. Though often overlooked in mainstream food history, cabbage and potato skillet remains a testament to the enduring spirit of low-income families during America's toughest decades. It's a reminder that even the simplest meals carry stories of hope, survival, and togetherness. Up next, we'll uncover a forgotten meal that used leftover bread to create a surprisingly comforting dish. Among the many meals that low-income American families relied on during the 1940s, creamed chipped beef on toast, colloquially known as SOS, holds a unique place in culinary history. The name, often joked about, stood for SH*T on a shingle, a grimly humorous reflection of its humble status, yet this dish was a vital source of sustenance during tough times. Originally popularized by the U.S. military during World War I and continuing through World War II, SOS became a household staple, especially for families struggling to stretch limited resources. The recipe was simple: dried, salted beef chipped into thin pieces, simmered in a creamy white sauce made from a basic roux and milk, then served over toasted bread. The brilliance of SOS lay in its economy and ease. The dried beef was inexpensive, had a long shelf life, and was readily available through rationing channels or government surplus. When combined with pantry staples like flour, butter, and milk, it transformed into a creamy, protein-rich meal that could fill hungry mouths without breaking the family budget. For many mothers, serving SOS was a way to provide a comforting, warm dish that felt almost luxurious despite its simplicity. It was often accompanied by boiled potatoes or a simple vegetable when available. However, its reputation as a military dish also carried a stigma. Some families viewed it as a last resort meal, eaten more out of necessity than preference. SOS also symbolized the broader story of adaptation and survival. With rationing limiting fresh meat and dairy, Americans had to rely on preserved goods and learn to make them palatable and filling. Creamed chipped beef was a perfect example of this ingenuity, turning sparse ingredients into something edible and sustaining. Though often the subject of jokes or disdain in later decades, SOS remains a vivid reminder of how families made do in difficult times, turning hardship into humble nourishment with resourcefulness and grit. Next, we'll explore a hearty vegetable dish that brought color and life to the wartime dinner table. As we move deeper into America's forgotten food history, one dish stands out for both its flavor and its legacy among struggling families: ham hocks and beans. This deeply rooted recipe was more than just a meal. It was a symbol of making something out of almost nothing. During the 1940s, when meat was rationed and money was scarce, ham hocks, the tough, bony ends of a pig's leg, were often the only affordable cut left at the butcher. They were cheap because they were considered undesirable by wealthier households. But for working-class and impoverished families, they were gold. The key to this dish was time. Ham hocks, rich with fat, marrow, and connective tissue, needed to be simmered slowly for hours, usually with dried beans, a pinch of salt, and perhaps a chopped onion if one was available. The result? A pot full of creamy, hearty beans infused with smoky, savory pork flavor, a meal that could feed a large family on pennies. Ham hocks and beans were particularly popular in the South and Midwest, where rural families passed down variations of the recipe for generations. In fact, this dish wasn't just survival food, it was heritage on a plate. African American families, especially those descended from enslaved people, had long used ham hocks as a way to infuse flavor into basic ingredients, a culinary tradition born of resilience and adaptation. For many, the slow bubbling of a bean pot on the stove was the backdrop to long evenings of conversation, mending clothes, or simply waiting out hard times together. It was food that nourished both body and soul, stretching far beyond its humble ingredients. This dish reminds us that history isn't only found in textbooks, it's simmering in old family pots and written into the aromas that once filled modest kitchens across the nation. In the kitchens of low-income American families during the 1940s, one of the most humble yet reliable dishes was cornmeal mush with fried onions. It was plain, cheap, and often overlooked in the grand story of American cuisine, but for many, it was a meal that made survival possible. Cornmeal mush had long been a staple among rural and working-class households, especially in the Appalachian regions and the South. Made from just cornmeal, water, and salt, it was essentially a thick porridge, similar in consistency to Italian polenta. What gave it power during the Depression and wartime years was its versatility and affordability. A sack of cornmeal could feed a family for weeks. For breakfast, families might eat it warm with a bit of milk or syrup if they had any. But when the mush cooled and set, it could be sliced and fried, giving it a crispy, golden crust. This is where the magic happened, and where onions joined the story. Frying slices of set cornmeal mush with caramelized onions not only added flavor but stretched ingredients into a satisfying dinner. Onions were one of the few fresh items that were widely available and inexpensive, and their sweetness after cooking made them feel almost indulgent in such a bare-bones dish. This meal was particularly beloved among coal miners, factory workers, and farmhands. It filled the belly, required little to no meat, and could be cooked over any heat source, even an outdoor fire. In fact, during fuel shortages or electricity rationing, many families relied on open flame or wood stove cooking to prepare meals like this. Cornmeal mush with fried onions might seem too simple to remember, but within its modest ingredients lies a powerful story of endurance. It tells us that the American spirit wasn't just about ambition, it was also about making the best of what you had, day after day. Coming up next, we dive into a one-dish wonder that brought Depression-era households together at the end of long, hard days. By the 1940s, with meat rationing, economic hardship, and war casting long shadows over American households, creativity in the kitchen became a lifeline. One of the most beloved answers to these challenges was the simple, filling, and endlessly adaptable egg noodle goulash. This dish wasn't originally American. It drew inspiration from Hungarian goulash, a spiced meat and paprika stew. But by the time it reached low-income kitchens across the U.S., it had been completely transformed, simplified to match what was available, and made to stretch. In most American homes of the time, egg noodle goulash was made with a handful of boiled egg noodles, a bit of canned or fresh tomato, onion, and, when possible, ground beef or bits of sausage. But often, especially in poorer households, the meat was missing altogether. Instead, the sauce itself became the star, a rich, tangy tomato base thickened with flour or mashed vegetables, clinging to each ribbon of pasta. What made this meal shine was its universality. It showed up in the tenement kitchens of New York, farmhouses in Iowa, and working-class homes in Detroit. Sometimes cheese was added if someone had a ration stamp to spare. Other times, dried herbs like oregano or bay leaf made their way into the pot, passed down from immigrant traditions. Egg noodles were a prized pantry item during this era. They were easy to make at home with flour and eggs, and they cooked fast, perfect for days when fuel was limited or families needed dinner quickly. Mothers often made large pots of goulash on Mondays and reheated it through the week, letting the flavors deepen with each passing day. This dish wasn't about luxury, it was about survival, ingenuity, and warmth. Egg noodle goulash carried memories of crowded tables, laughter amid hardship, and meals that filled more than just stomachs. Next, we turn to a forgotten pie that wasn't made for dessert, but for dinner, a Depression-era twist on comfort food with roots in both thrift and tradition. In the 1940s, when American families had to rely on pantry staples and make every bite count, the rice and tomato casserole became a comforting favorite, not for its extravagance, but for its simplicity, warmth, and resourcefulness. This humble dish was built around two of the most accessible ingredients of the era: rice and canned tomatoes. Both were inexpensive, non-perishable, and easy to find even when rations were tight. For low-income families, they weren't just ingredients, they were survival tools. Rice was especially valued for its ability to bulk up meals. Just a single cup could stretch across an entire dish, feeding a family and still leaving leftovers. Tomatoes added brightness and flavor, and when stewed or canned, they were available year-round, even in winter months when gardens lay dormant. The basic version of the casserole involved cooked rice layered or mixed with stewed tomatoes, a bit of salt, and maybe a sprinkle of pepper or dried herbs. But creative cooks always found ways to enhance it. Some households added a spoonful of lard or a cube of bouillon to deepen the flavor. Others, when rations allowed, stirred in bits of cheese, leftover bacon grease, or even diced vegetables from a Victory Garden harvest. Baked slowly in ceramic or glass casserole dishes, it emerged from the oven piping hot, bubbling around the edges, and infused with the smells of comfort and nourishment. It wasn't flashy, but it filled the house with warmth, a welcome presence during uncertain times. This casserole was more than food, it was a symbol. A dish that said, "We don't have much, but we have enough. And we can make it work." In a time when so many families were living hand-to-mouth, rice and tomato casserole offered both sustenance and a quiet sense of dignity. It reminds us that American resilience was often built in kitchens like these, one spoonful at a time. Up next, we revisit a Depression-era dessert that wasn't sweet at all, yet filled empty stomachs like nothing else could. In the harsh realities of 1940s America, when meat was scarce, expensive, and heavily rationed, families often turned to cuts that modern kitchens would overlook, and liver was at the top of that list. Served with caramelized onions and rich gravy, this meal became a staple of low-income households across the country. Why liver? Quite simply, it was cheap, available, and packed with nutrition. Butchers frequently gave it away at a discount, knowing it wasn't in high demand. Yet those who understood its value, especially mothers feeding large families, knew it could be a nutritional powerhouse. Liver is rich in iron, protein, and essential vitamins, making it a lifeline during a time when malnutrition was a real threat. The dish's pungent flavor wasn't always loved by children, but it was softened by slow-cooked onions, sautéed until golden and sweet, and a homemade gravy that tied everything together. Some families dredged the liver in flour before frying it to give it a crispy edge and help the gravy cling. Others served it over mashed potatoes or bread, allowing every drop of the savory sauce to be soaked up. This meal was especially popular in urban areas where immigrant communities had long traditions of nose-to-tail cooking. In Polish, Irish, and Italian households, liver had long been respected, and this respect filtered into working-class American culture during the Great Depression and World War II. More than a meal, liver and onions in gravy became a lesson in resourcefulness. It taught families how to embrace what was available, how to transform something overlooked into something nourishing, even memorable. As one 1942 cookbook noted, "It's not what you serve, but how you serve it." That philosophy made liver and onions more than just food, it made it an expression of dignity in tough times. Next, We turn to a simple fried dish that once turned cornmeal and onions into pure survival on a plate. When survival depended on using every last scrap, American families of the 1940s learned to turn the humblest ingredients into hearty meals, and few dishes captured this spirit better than oxtail soup. Back then, oxtail wasn't considered a delicacy. It was a butcher's leftover, bony, tough, and often given away for pennies. But for low-income families, it was pure gold. Not because of what it was, but because of what it could become. With time and patience, oxtail transformed. When simmered slowly, often for hours on a wood-fired stove, the meat would release rich gelatin, flavoring the broth and thickening it naturally. The bones yielded deep, savory flavor, while the small pockets of tender meat added heartiness. Families would often cook the oxtail down with whatever they had on hand: carrots, potatoes, turnips, celery, onions, anything from the root cellar or victory garden. The result was a nutrient-rich, warming stew that could stretch across multiple meals. Oxtail soup was also a cultural import, carried into American kitchens by immigrant communities who already knew the value of using every part of the animal. African American families in the South, Italian immigrants in New York, and working-class Irish households all embraced the dish, weaving it into their own culinary traditions. But beyond sustenance, oxtail soup told a story of kitchens where nothing was wasted and where flavor was coaxed from time and care, not expensive ingredients. It was common to see the soup bubbling away on a stove from morning until dusk, filling the air with the scent of survival and quiet comfort. In many homes, this dish meant more than just dinner. It was a reminder that even the toughest cuts, given enough time, could become something rich and nourishing, just like the families who endured those hard times with patience and grit. Coming up next, we revisit a cornmeal-based dish that became the backbone of countless Depression-era dinners. If there's any dish that perfectly captures the resourcefulness of 1940s America, it's potato peel soup. It wasn't just food, it was a symbol of survival, born from the belief that nothing should be thrown away, not even the skins of potatoes. During the Great Depression and wartime rationing, potatoes were one of the most widely consumed foods in America. But when even whole potatoes were a luxury, families saved the peels, what most people would toss, and turned them into something warm and filling. In low-income households, mothers would collect potato skins from earlier meals, store them carefully, and once enough had been gathered, simmer them into a thin, nourishing broth. These peels still contained valuable nutrients like potassium and fiber, and when slow-cooked with herbs, salt, maybe a carrot or onion if available, they offered just enough sustenance to stretch another day. In some cases, meat bones or bacon grease were added to enrich the flavor, but often, this soup remained starkly simple, just potato skins, water, and hope. That was the genius of it, creating something from what looked like nothing. Church soup kitchens, boarding houses, and farming families across rural America relied on this method to feed many with very little. In fact, stories exist of children being sent door to door not to ask for food, but to ask for their neighbors' discarded potato peels, a quiet testament to just how dire the times had become. Yet there was dignity in this dish. It didn't beg for pity. Instead, it demonstrated how ordinary people made extraordinary choices just to make ends meet. Potato peel soup became a symbol of frugality, endurance, and community, where every scrap had a purpose and every bowl told a story. Next, we'll explore a forgotten fried dish that brought a burst of crispy comfort in the most unexpected way. As we move deeper into the kitchens of 1940s low-income America, we uncover a humble dish that speaks volumes about how families managed to fill empty stomachs with warmth and flavor: the macaroni and canned tomato skillet. This dish was born from pure practicality. During the Great Depression and the war years, pantry staples like elbow macaroni and canned tomatoes were lifesavers. They were cheap, shelf-stable, and versatile, everything a struggling household needed. Many homes didn't have access to fresh produce or meats, but a single can of tomatoes, sometimes thinned out with water or broth, could transform a pound of dry pasta into a filling meal for an entire family. The acidic brightness of tomatoes helped cut through the monotony of starch-heavy diets, and when cooked together in a single skillet, it meant less cleanup, less fuel used, and less waste, a triple victory for struggling mothers. Some families added chopped onions, garlic, or herbs from their victory gardens. If they were lucky, a sprinkle of cheese or a pinch of dried beef scraps might be stirred in for extra protein and taste. But at its core, this meal was about stretching the most basic ingredients to their limits. The skillet itself, often a battered cast iron pan passed down through generations, became a symbol of frugality and family unity. Children would gather as the familiar scent of simmering tomatoes and bubbling pasta filled the air, creating not just nourishment, but comfort. It's easy to overlook meals like this today, but in the 1940s, this simple combination represented hope in a pan. It was dependable. It was affordable. And most importantly, it was something families could count on when there wasn't much else to count on. Next, we'll dive into a breakfast for dinner favorite that brought warmth to many cold evenings. As we journey further into the forgotten recipes of low-income families from 1940s America, we come across a dish that didn't just survive hardship, it carried generations of immigrant memories. Cabbage and noodles, often called haluski by those of Eastern European descent. During the early 20th century, America saw a large wave of immigrants from Slovakia, Poland, and Ukraine, many of whom settled in coal towns, steel cities, and rural farming communities. They brought with them hearty, filling recipes born from centuries of peasant resilience. One of the most cherished among them was haluski. The dish itself is incredibly simple: boiled egg noodles tossed with pan-fried cabbage, often cooked in a bit of lard or leftover bacon grease. Salt, pepper, and onions were all the seasoning needed. Sometimes, when meat was available, crumbled bacon or sausage bits were added, but more often than not, it remained meatless, a true Depression-era staple. What made haluski powerful was its versatility and economy. A single head of cabbage and a handful of dry noodles could serve a family, stretch over days, and cost next to nothing. Cabbage kept well in root cellars, noodles were cheap to make or buy, and the flavor deepened over time as it was reheated in skillets. But beyond the economics, haluski represented cultural survival. Immigrant mothers passed the recipe to their daughters, who kept the tradition alive even as they faced language barriers, discrimination, and crushing poverty. In neighborhoods where families lived hand to mouth, haluski brought people together. In the 1940s, this dish appeared on countless tables not just as sustenance, but as a reminder of where people came from and what they were determined to preserve. Coming up next, we'll explore a meal that took scraps from butcher's blocks and turned them into a rich, beloved dish of the working poor. As we continue unveiling the survival recipes of 1940s low-income American families, we arrive at a dish that epitomizes thrift, creativity, and comfort: shepherd's pie with leftovers. During the difficult years of the Great Depression and World War II, food scarcity forced families to become masters of resourcefulness. Shepherd's pie, in its humble form, was a direct response to this challenge, a way to transform leftovers into a hearty, warm meal that fed entire families without waste. Unlike the traditional British version made with ground lamb, American versions of shepherd's pie adapted to what was available. Typically, this meant using bits of leftover meat, often beef or even canned meat scraps, layered under a blanket of mashed potatoes, sometimes mixed with cooked vegetables like peas, carrots, or onions. The dish was assembled in a simple baking dish or cast iron skillet and baked until the mashed potato topping turned golden brown and crisped on the edges. It was a satisfying, filling meal that made every last morsel count. Shepherd's pie became a staple for families with tight budgets because it was incredibly flexible. No two recipes were alike. Each family's version reflected what they had on hand, making it a symbol of American ingenuity and frugality in the face of hardship. In many homes, the pie wasn't just dinner, it was a celebration of survival, proof that even in the hardest times, families could come together around the table, share what little they had, and find warmth in one another. This dish reminds us that poverty did not mean deprivation of flavor or love, but instead, inspired creativity that lives on in recipes passed through generations. Up next, we will explore a simple yet nourishing vegetable stew that provided both comfort and nutrients to struggling families. As we journey through the resourceful recipes of America's low-income families in the 1940s, one dish stands out for its frugality and nourishment: split pea and ham bone soup. During the Depression and wartime years, every scrap of food mattered. Ham bones, leftovers from holiday meals or special occasions, were too valuable to discard. Instead, families turned these humble bones into a rich broth, simmered slowly with dried split peas to create a thick, hearty soup. Split peas were an affordable and shelf-stable source of protein and fiber, making them a vital ingredient for families facing economic hardship. Paired with the smoky flavor of ham bones, the soup became a comforting and sustaining staple, especially during harsh winters. The preparation was simple but required time and care. The ham bone, often studded with small bits of meat and fat, would be boiled for hours to extract every ounce of flavor and nutrition. Then, split peas and sometimes chopped vegetables like carrots, onions, and celery were added, simmering until tender. This dish not only provided warmth but also a feeling of abundance when ingredients were scarce. It was a testament to the ingenuity and thriftiness of American families who made the most of leftovers and dried goods. Split pea and ham bone soup remains a symbol of resilience, how even in difficult times, people found ways to turn minimal resources into meals that comforted body and soul. Next, we'll explore a simple, filling meal made from a root vegetable that was a staple on many Depression-era tables. As we continue exploring the resourceful meals that sustained low-income American families during the 1940s, we come across a truly ingenious dish known as mock chicken stew. This humble stew was not made with Raal chicken, but instead was a clever imitation designed to provide the comfort and warmth of a chicken stew without the expense. In those tough times, chicken was often a luxury many families could not afford regularly. Instead, they turned to simple, inexpensive ingredients to recreate the flavors and heartiness of their favorite meals. Mock chicken stew relied heavily on dumplings, small, soft dough balls made from flour, water, and a pinch of salt. These dumplings absorbed the rich, savory gravy made from broth scraps, seasonings, and sometimes bits of leftover meat or fat. The gravy itself was a masterpiece of thriftiness. Families would use every little bit of broth from bones, vegetables, or canned goods to create a thick, flavorful sauce. By simmering the stew slowly, the flavors melded together, creating a dish that was comforting, filling, and surprisingly delicious given its minimal ingredients. Mock chicken stew was more than just a meal. It was a symbol of creativity and resilience. It showed how families during the Depression and war years refused to let scarcity define their dinners. Instead, they embraced what they had, transforming humble pantry staples into something nourishing and heartwarming. This dish highlights the spirit of those times, the ability to adapt, improvise, and find comfort even in the most difficult circumstances. It was a testament to the strength and resourcefulness of American families, reminding us that sometimes the simplest meals carry the deepest meaning. Continuing our journey through the inventive meals of 1940s low-income American families, we arrive at a classic staple: baked beans and salt pork. This hearty dish was a cornerstone of frugal cooking during the Depression and wartime years, prized for its simple ingredients and satisfying flavors. Baked beans, made from dried navy beans or similar varieties, were inexpensive, easy to store, and packed with protein and fiber, essential nutrients during times of scarcity. Paired with salt pork, a preserved cut of pork cured with salt, this dish became a rich, filling meal that could feed entire families on a tight budget. Salt pork was a common pantry staple in many homes, valued for its long shelf life and ability to add depth of flavor to otherwise plain beans. The curing process allowed families to keep pork edible for months without refrigeration, a critical advantage before widespread freezer use. Preparing baked beans and salt pork was a slow, patient process. Beans were soaked overnight, then simmered for hours alongside chunks of salt pork. The fat from the pork rendered slowly, infusing the beans with smoky, savory richness. Often, simple seasonings like molasses, onions, or mustard were added to enhance the flavor, turning basic ingredients into a comforting, aromatic dish. This meal symbolized resilience and thriftiness, transforming humble pantry staples into something nourishing and warm. It was especially important during wartime rationing when fresh meat was scarce, and families had to rely on preserved goods and dried legumes. Baked beans and salt pork reflects the spirit of endurance that helped low-income American families navigate the hardships of the 1940s, proving that resourcefulness could turn the simplest ingredients into sustenance and comfort. As we move deeper into the resourceful kitchens of 1940s low-income American families, we arrive at a dish that speaks to the heart of survival cooking: rice and raisin porridge. This humble, comforting meal was often served for breakfast or even dinner when times were especially lean. Rice was a widely available staple thanks to its affordability, long shelf life, and nutritional value. When paired with a handful of raisins, one of the few sweeteners within reach for many, it became a filling, warm bowl of energy, stretching calories in the most budget-friendly way. But beyond its simplicity, this porridge had emotional significance. It was one of the few sweet foods many children looked forward to during the harsh years of the Great Depression and the wartime era. Families who couldn't afford fresh fruit or meat turned to dried goods like raisins, which offered a burst of flavor and natural sugar. Preparation was straightforward but required attention. The rice was boiled until soft, and then milk, or even watered-down evaporated milk, was added to create a creamy consistency. Raisins were stirred in toward the end, plumping up in the warmth and releasing their subtle sweetness into the dish. Sometimes, if a family had access to it, a dash of cinnamon or a spoonful of sugar elevated the flavor, turning a meager bowl of porridge into a cherished treat. Rice and raisin porridge was more than food, it was comfort in a bowl. It filled bellies without emptying wallets. For mothers trying to nourish multiple children on just a few cents a day, this dish was salvation. This porridge reminds us that even in the toughest of times, Americans found ways to offer a bit of warmth, love, and sweetness, one simple meal at a time. As we inch closer to the end of this journey through America's forgotten kitchens, we now uncover a meal that defined frugality and pure kitchen ingenuity: vegetable scrap stew. During the 1940s, especially in wartime and post-Depression America, every part of every vegetable mattered. Waste was not just frowned upon, it was nearly criminal in households scraping by on rations and tiny grocery budgets. Enter the scrap stew, a bubbling pot of odds and ends that carried the spirit of resilience in every ladle. This stew wasn't made from a recipe, but rather from whatever was available. Onion skins, carrot tops, celery leaves, potato peels, overripe tomatoes, the tough ends of green beans, no part was too humble. Families saved their vegetable scraps throughout the week, storing them in iceboxes or root cellars, until they had enough to make a pot. The brilliance lay not only in its use of waste but in how it transformed that waste into something nourishing. Scraps were boiled slowly in water to create a base, often enhanced with salt, pepper, and perhaps a leftover meat bone if one was available. Then, a starch like barley, rice, or macaroni might be added to bulk it up. What resulted was a savory, deeply flavorful broth, far more than the sum of its parts. Vegetable scrap stew wasn't just food, it was an act of defiance against hunger. It taught children that value lies not in perfection, but in potential. Mothers turned peels and trimmings into warmth and sustenance. It was also one of the earliest examples of what we'd now call sustainable cooking. In a time before food waste was a trending topic, low-income American families were already masters of it, and this stew was their unsung masterpiece. As we come to the final meal in our journey through the forgotten kitchens of 1940s low-income American families, we end not with a hearty stew or a meaty casserole, but with one of the simplest, most beloved Depression-era comfort dishes: the cornbread and milk bowl. This meal wasn't fancy. In fact, it was often seen as a last resort, but to many, it tasted like home. A slice of leftover cornbread, crumbled into a bowl, then drowned in cold milk, or if available, buttermilk, made for a meal that was quick, cheap, and oddly satisfying. No sugar, no spices, just humble ingredients, eaten in silence after long days of work or school. In rural Southern households, especially across Appalachia and the Deep South, this dish was more than a meal. It was a tradition passed down through generations. Families who couldn't afford meat or vegetables still had cornmeal, often self-ground, and fresh milk from a cow or neighbor's farm. It required no stove, no firewood, no fuss. Just a bowl, a spoon, and a moment of rest. What made this dish powerful wasn't its flavor, it was its symbolism. In an America that was struggling to recover from the Great Depression and entering a new world war, cornbread and milk represented survival. It was a reminder that you didn't need much to endure, just enough to keep going. Many who grew up eating it never forgot it, and even decades later, some recreated it not out of necessity, but nostalgia. It reminded them of simpler, if tougher, times, and the grit it took to survive. And that brings us to the end of this episode, a heartfelt tribute to the resilience, resourcefulness, and quiet courage of forgotten American families. These meals were born out of hardship, but they live on as powerful stories of hope. Stay tuned, there's more forgotten history to uncover in the next episode.